Ladies and gentlemen, we spend much of our lives trying to avoid anger. We say things like, I won't let that person get to me, or I've learned to stay calm. But here's the truth. What if you were going about it all wrong? What if trying not to be angry is precisely the thing that feeds your anger?
Oh.
And what if your deepest desire to avoid being bothered by others only makes the situation worse? I want to take you on a journey today, not to find a way to stop being angry, but to discover how you can get angry, upset, and bothered by anyone. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but stay with me. In this speech, I will show you how you are already giving others the power to disturb your peace, and I will offer a perspective so profound, it might change the way you react to everything. The illusion of control. So let's start with this. You believe you have control over your emotions, don't you? But if we're honest with ourselves, the moment someone says or does something that pushes your buttons, you lose that illusion of control. Anger isn't something you can just flick off like a switch. It rises, usually in the most inconvenient ways. The key is understanding that the way you respond to the world and to others is not a matter of willpower, but of perception. Perception that has been shaped over a lifetime. The paradox of emotional reactivity now. Let's examine the paradox. The very attempt to control our emotions makes us more vulnerable to them. The more you try not to get angry, the more you end up feeling that anger rises. The mind, seeking certainty, uses anger as a tool. Because when you get angry, you feel as though you're gaining control, even if it's just for a fleeting moment. Anger gives the illusion of power, but in reality it chains you to the whims of others. Awareness of external and internal forces. There is no doubt that people's actions and words affect us. But what if I told you that your response to those actions is not entirely determined by them? When you are bothered, it's not just because of what someone else did. It's because of how your mind interprets it. You are not just a passive recipient of external events. You are the creator of your emotional state. The key to understanding this is awareness. When you're aware of your internal triggers, you can begin to see how much you are contributing to your own suffering. The role of expectations in anger, one of the most profound sources of anger, is expectation. We expect others to behave in certain ways, to treat us a certain way, and when they don't meet our expectations, frustration and anger naturally follow. But who set those expectations? Was it them or was it you? When you understand that your anger often comes from your own unmet expectations, you begin to see how much control you actually have over your emotional responses. The less you expect from others, the less anger will rise in you. Freedom in non-reactivity. Here's the twist. You don't have to stop feeling angry, but you can stop reacting to it. You see, most people think that the only way to deal with anger is to suppress it, to fight it. But what if you simply watched it? When you allow the anger to arise and simply witness it without engaging, it loses its grip over you. You're not fighting it. You're not trying to push it away. You're simply observing it, knowing that it, like everything else, will pass. This is the true power of non-reaction. The path to emotional liberation. And so we come to the path of liberation. To stop being disturbed by others, you must stop giving them the power to dictate your emotions. You must stop identifying with your reactions and begin to see them as temporary visitors in your mind. By cultivating awareness and non-reactivity, you can free yourself from the endless cycle of emotional enslavement. No one, not even the most difficult person in your life, has the power to truly disturb you unless you grant it to them. So, my friends, here's the irony. If you want to stop getting angry and bothered, the first thing you need to do is learn how to be angry, learn how to react. Learn how to react, and then learn how to let go. Once you understand this, once you understand that your anger is only a reflection of your own inner world, you will find that the world around you has less power over you than you ever imagined. And that, my friends, is the true path to emotional freedom. When we think about emotions, we often imagine that we can control them at will, especially in the context of anger. We believe that if we try hard enough, if we practice enough self-discipline, we can stop ourselves from getting angry. In reality, this belief that we can control our emotions, particularly anger, is a form of illusion. The notion that anger is something we can just turn off or on is rooted in the idea that we have full control over our emotional reactions. However, this perspective overlooks the complexity of human experience and the depth of our emotional nature. Emotions, especially anger, are not simple switches that can be flicked at will. They are intricate responses shaped by our mind, body, and past experiences. Anger is often triggered by external circumstances, but its roots lie deep within us in our perceptions, expectations, and the way we've been conditioned to respond to the world. We believe we should be in control of how we feel. This belief, however, sets us up for frustration because the more we try to control our emotions, the more we find that they become uncontrollable. What happens in that moment of trying to repress anger is that it begins to build up, sometimes intensifying in unexpected ways. It's as if we create a vacuum in which the emotion is waiting to be released in a more intense form because we're not allowing it to move freely as it needs to. This kind of emotional suppression doesn't remove anger. It suppresses it until it finally bursts forth, often in a moment when we least expect it, or in a way that's disproportionate to the actual event. The more we strive to master our emotions through sheer willpower, the more we reinforce the illusion that we have control. However, this only causes us to be reactive, unable to respond to our emotions in a calm and measured way. Instead of being in the present moment, we are entangled in our inner struggle, caught between what we feel and what we think we should feel. It becomes a battle between trying to maintain composure and dealing with the overwhelming force of our emotions. This tug-of-war can create a vicious cycle of emotional suppression, leading to more intense emotional reactions later on. In truth, the idea of having control over our emotions, especially anger, is a misconception. Anger, like all emotions, comes and goes, ebbing and flowing like waves in the ocean. The more we try to control it, the more we create tension, not only with our emotions, but also within ourselves. The mind, in its effort to suppress anger, actually intensifies it by resisting its natural flow. This resistance is the very thing that makes anger feel uncontrollable. The key, then, is not to control anger, but to recognize it, to observe it without attaching to it, and to allow it to pass naturally, just as any other emotion would. When we embrace the reality that we cannot fully control our emotions, we can begin to shift our perspective. We don't have to be afraid of anger or any other emotion. We simply need to recognize it for what it is, a response, an energetic movement through the body and mind that will eventually pass. In that recognition, we free ourselves from the cycle of reactivity. We stop battling with the emotion and start allowing it to exist as part of our human experience. By doing so, we cultivate a deeper sense of understanding and peace within ourselves, realizing that our emotions are not the enemy, but rather messengers guiding us toward greater awareness. The paradox of emotional reactivity is that, despite our best efforts to avoid or suppress our emotions, they often become more intense and pervasive. The more we resist them, the more power they seem to have us. This creates a kind of emotional paradox. The harder we try to maintain control over our emotions, the more likely we are to find ourselves being swept away by them. It's as though the very act of attempt to manage or suppress our emotions fuels their strength, making them harder to deal with in the long run. This paradox speaks to the complexity of our emotional nature, where the effort to control emotions of us only increases the grip they have on us. So, when we react emotionally, it's usually because we are trying to make sense of something external that threatens our sense of stability or comfort. For example, someone might say something that insults us, and immediately we feel anger or frustration. In this moment, the mind steps in and tries to make sense of the situation. I shouldn't be treated this way, or this person is out of line. However, what often happens next is that the mind begins to spiral into a cascade of thoughts, judgments, and emotional reactions. The initial anger, which could have been a brief response, transforms into something much larger and more uncontrollable. The more we allow the mind to ruminate on the situation, the more emotionally charged we become. It's here that the paradox becomes clear. The mind, which tries to solve the problem of our anger by analyzing it, only magnifies it. By fixating on why we're angry, we deepen the emotional experience. This fixation, this cycle of emotional reactivity, is what makes the initial feeling of anger turn into an emotional storm. We keep the cycle alive through our thoughts, which in turn reinforce the emotion. The anger feeds off the thoughts we have about the situation, and soon enough, it can spiral out of control. This is the paradox. By trying to control the emotion, we lose control over it entirely. The mind is constantly trying to create certainty, especially when things feel chaotic or uncomfortable. Long. Anger often arises because something threatens our sense of safety, our expectations, or our view of the world. When this happens, the mind seeks to regain control by generating judgments, accusations, and rationalizations about the situation. It wants to make things right again, often by blaming the external source of the irritation. But this is where the paradox lies. The more the mind seeks to fix the anger, the more entrenched it becomes in the emotion itself. In a sense, we can say that the mind's attempt to control emotions is what makes them more uncontrollable. The key to understanding this paradox is in the awareness of this cycle. Recognizing that our emotional reactions are not just a result of what's happening in the world, but are also deeply intertwined with our inner narrative, is the first step in breaking free from this cycle. The more we engage in the story that the mind creates about why we're angry, the more we reinforce the emotion. But if we can step outside the story, if we can observe the emotion without getting swept up in the mind's judgments, we begin to break the hold that emotional reactivity has over us. The paradox dissolves when we stop trying to control our emotions and instead allow them to arise and fade naturally, without adding fuel to the fire through us. Ultimately, the paradox of emotional reactivity teaches us that the effort to control our emotions is often what keeps us trapped in them. True emotional freedom comes not from controlling our emotions, but from understanding them and learning to step back, observe, and allow them to move through us without resistance. In this way, we regain control not by suppressing or avoiding our emotions, but by embracing them with awareness, letting them pass through us without identifying with them. This shift in perspective allows us to stop the cycle of emotional escalation and to find peace within, no matter the external circumstances. Our emotional responses, particularly anger, are often seen as a reaction to external events, something someone says or does, a situation that doesn't go as planned, or an expectation that isn't met. However, this view of emotions as purely reactive is limited and fails to capture the complexity of how we experience and react to the world. While it's true that external events can trigger emotional responses, what's often overlooked is the profound role that our internal processes play in shaping those reactions. Our thoughts, beliefs, past experiences, and the conditioning we've absorbed over a lifetime all influence how we interpret and respond to external stimuli. In other words, our emotions are not just reactions to the world outside of us. They are a dynamic interplay between what's happening externally and what's going on inside us. At the heart of this interplay is the idea that we are not passive recipients of emotional experiences. We have an active role in shaping our emotional responses through the lens of our mind. Every time we feel anger, frustration, or any other intense emotion, it is not just because of what someone has done or said, but also because of the way we interpret that action. The meaning we attach to events plays a huge role in determining how we will respond emotionally. For example, if someone criticizes us and we interpret that criticism as an attack on our character, we are more likely to feel anger or defensiveness. But if we see that same criticism as constructive feedback or something that is not a reflection of our worth, we may respond with curiosity or calm. This is where the power of awareness comes into play. By recognizing the role of our internal processes in shaping our emotional responses, we can begin to separate the external event from our internal interpretation of it. This insight doesn't eliminate external triggers, but it does shift the focus to where we have the most control, our mind. When we become aware of the mental patterns that drive our emotional reactions, we can begin to challenge those patterns and create new, more balanced ways of responding. The interplay between external events and internal responses also highlights the importance of self-awareness. The more aware we are of our emotional triggers, the more we can start to see how we are giving others power over our emotional state. Often, we react to situations without fully understanding why we feel the way we do. We might say things like, "They made me so angry," or "I couldn't help it." But this kind of thinking overlooks the crucial role that our internal processes play in shaping our emotions. If we don't take the time to understand the root causes of our emotions, we remain at the mercy of external circumstances. We become victims of our own emotional reactivity. When we cultivate awareness, we start to realize that our emotional responses are not fixed or inevitable. They are dynamic and fluid, shaped by our thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations. This realization opens the door to emotional freedom. We are no longer slaves to external events or the way others behave. Instead, we recognize that our emotions are not dictated by the outside world, but by the way we engage with it internally. This shift in perspective gives us the power to choose our responses, to change the way we interpret situations, and ultimately to transform our emotional experiences. Understanding the interplay between external and internal forces is an empowering realization. It shows us that we are not helpless in the face of our emotions. By becoming more aware of our internal world, the beliefs, thoughts, and assumptions that shape our perception of reality, we can begin to break free from the patterns of reactivity that keep us locked in cycles of frustration, anger, and emotional turmoil. This awareness is the first step toward taking responsibility for our emotional state and reclaiming the power to choose how we respond to the world around us. Through awareness, we gain the freedom to experience emotions without being controlled by them. One of the most common sources of anger is unmet expectations. We expect the world, and especially other people, to behave in certain ways. We believe that our desires, our needs, or our preferences should be respected and fulfilled. When these expectations are not met, frustration arises. This is especially true in our relationships with others. We expect them to act in a way that aligns with our beliefs, values, or desires. And when they don't, we feel betrayed, misunderstood, or disrespected. This expectation becomes the fuel for anger. What makes this situation even more complex is that we rarely question where these expectations come from. Often they are deeply embedded in us, shaped by our upbringing, culture, and experience. We are taught, either explicitly or implicitly, what is a right or what is acceptable or unacceptable. These teachings become our mental blueprint, and we use them to measure how others should behave. When people fall short of these internalized standards, anger emerges as a natural response. It's as if the world has not lived up to the script we've written for it. However, this reliance on expectations can be deeply limiting. Expectations, by their very nature, are rooted in the belief that we can control or predict the behavior of others. We assume that we know how things should unfold and what people should do, and we grow upset when life does not adhere to our vision. Yet the reality is that people are unpredictable, complex, and often act according to their own unique needs, desires, and perspectives. When we expect others to behave in a way that is consistent with our own desires, we ignore the fact that they have their own autonomy, their own worldview, and their own worldviews for acting as they do. This disconnect between our expectations and the reality of others' behavior often leads to conflict, and this conflict breeds anger. The anger isn't necessarily about the behavior itself, but about the gap between what we expected and what actually happened. We become frustrated because the world didn't match our mental picture of how it should be. We can begin to challenge those patterns and create new, more balanced ways of responding. In addition, our expectations of others are often unconscious. We don't actively create them. They are deeply ingrained in us. The first step in freeing ourselves from this cycle of anger is to become aware of the expectations we carry. Once we recognize that our anger is tied to unmet expectations, we can begin to question those expectations. Are they fair? Are they reasonable? Are they based on an accurate understanding of the situation or the other person? Let's take a practical example. Imagine you're in a close friendship or a romantic relationship. Expect the other person to always be there for you when you need them. This expectation is born out of the belief that relationships are about mutual support, and that people who care about each other should prioritize one another's needs. Now let's say that on a particular day the other person doesn't meet that expectation. They are busy with their own life, or perhaps they simply don't respond in the way you hoped. Immediately you feel anger or frustration. But the root of this emotion is not the other person's actions. The root is the unspoken expectation that they should always be available to you no matter what. When that expectation is violated, the emotion that follows is not just disappointment, it's anger. By examining this expectation, we can begin to shift our perspective. It's not that the other person is wrong or bad for not meeting our expectation. It's that we have placed an unrealistic demand on them. Expectations, when unchecked, can create a sense of entitlement or entitlement-based anger. When we free ourselves from the pressure of expecting others to behave according to our mental scripts, we reduce the likelihood of feeling anger when those expectations are inevitably unmet. Moreover, we can start to embrace a more open-minded and accepting approach to the people in our lives. Instead of expecting them to fit into a rigid framework of how they should act, we can learn to appreciate them for who they are, flaws and all. By loosening our grip on these expectations, we free ourselves from the frustration that arises when others don't behave in the ways we desire. This doesn't mean we should lower our standards or accept toxic behavior. It means we release the need to control others and recognize that their actions are not a reflection of our worth or value. Ultimately, the key to freeing ourselves from the cycle of anger triggered by unmet expectations is to develop a greater sense of flexibility and acceptance. We must learn to approach life with an open mind, ready to accept the unpredictability and complexity of human behavior. By doing so, we can reduce the emotional charge that comes from unmet expectations and cultivate a deeper sense of peace, regardless of how others behave. One of the most profound shifts in how we approach our emotions, particularly anger, comes when we begin to explore the concept of non-reaction. Non-reaction. The idea of non-reaction might seem counterintuitive, especially when it comes to powerful emotions like anger. After all, many of us are conditioned to think that the only way to deal with anger is to either express it forcefully or suppress it completely. Yet non-reaction offers a third path, one that involves observing our emotions without being swept away by them. This doesn't mean denying or repressing what we feel. Rather, it means recognizing the emotion for what it is, a temporary experience that doesn't need to control us. Non-reaction is the practice of being present with your emotions without letting them take over your behavior or thoughts. It's not about fighting your anger or pretending you don't feel it. Rather, it's about observing the sensation of anger as it arises, acknowledging its presence, and allowing it to exist without judgment or attachment. This might sound easy in theory, but it's an incredibly powerful shift in perspective when we start to truly apply it in our lives. Anger, like any emotion, has a natural rise and fall. When we engage in non-reaction, we allow that rise and fall to happen without interfering. We don't try to hold on to the anger, and we don't try to push it away. We simply allow it to be. The key to non-reaction is recognizing that emotions are not facts. They are simply transient experiences that come and go. When we react to anger, we often allow it to dictate our thoughts and actions, leading to further frustration and escalation. But when we practice of feeling threatened by another person's words or actions, we see them for what they are, just another human being reacting to their own thoughts, experiences, and feelings. We no longer personalize their behavior as a reflection of our worth. We can respond with empathy, understanding, and even compassion, recognizing that their actions are often a result of their own emotional turbulence, rather than a direct assault on our value. By shifting our focus from external validation to internal validation, we create a sense of emotional independence. We no longer need to rely on others to make us feel worthy, and we free ourselves from the tyranny of reactive anger. This doesn't mean that we don't experience anger, but it does mean that we can experience it without it defining us or dictating our actions. We can observe the anger without becoming it, and in doing so, we create the space for more thoughtful, conscious responses to the world around us. This shift in perspective also allows us to develop more authentic and fulfilling relationships. When we are not dependent on others for our sense of self-worth, we are able to engage with them from a place of true connection, rather than from a place of need, rather than from a place of We no longer seek validation from others, but instead share our lives and experiences from a place of mutual respect and understanding. In this way, we build relationships that are grounded in genuine connection rather than in the ego-driven need for validation. Ultimately, by learning to separate our self-worth from the behavior of others, we free ourselves from the cycle of anger and frustration. We reclaim our emotional autonomy, and we create a more peaceful, balanced relationship with both ourselves and the world around us. This is the path to true emotional freedom. In conclusion, the journey to understanding and transforming our anger is not about controlling it, suppressing it, or trying to eradicate it entirely. It's about recognizing that anger, like all emotions, is a natural part of the human experience. By shifting our focus from reacting to emotions impulsively to observing and understanding them with awareness, we begin to break free from the cycles of emotional reactivity that often rule our lives. We come to see that anger is not something to fear or avoid, but something to acknowledge and allow to move through us without attaching our identity to it. By understanding the role of unmet expectations, the interplay of internal and external influences, and the profound power of non-reaction, we empower ourselves to respond with greater calm and clarity. The key lies in detaching our sense of self-worth from the approval or actions of others. When we no longer rely on external validation to define our value, we find ourselves less vulnerable to anger triggered by the behaviors of others. Instead, we develop the ability to respond thoughtfully based on our inner strength and understanding, rather than reacting out of frustration or defensiveness. Ultimately, the practice of mindfulness and self-awareness allows us to live more freely and peacefully. We are no longer slaves to our emotions or the reactions of others, but masters of our own emotional state. This transformation is not an overnight process, but through consistent practice, it can lead to a profound sense of emotional freedom. By embracing our emotions without letting them control us, we can find deeper peace, create more authentic connections, and move through life with a greater sense of balance and purpose.